The morning Matilda Grantley arrived in Goldhaven, it was raining. Not the soft, forgiving kind of rain that poets write about in leather-bound journals. This was the relentless grey rain of the Ohio Valley in late November, the kind that soaks through wool coats and reminds you without ceremony that the world has no particular interest in your circumstances. She stepped off the train with one trunk, one leather satchel, and no illusions left to protect her. The station platform was crowded with men in tall hats and women clutching packages, all of them moving with the practiced confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. Matilda stood still for a moment in the middle of all that motion, not because she was lost, but because she was allowing herself one final breath before she walked into the life she had chosen, or rather, the life that had chosen her when every other door had closed. She was the only daughter of Gerald Grantley, once a respected mill owner in Columbus, Ohio, a man who had built a modest fortune through honest work and lost it over the course of 3 slow years, through a combination of poor investments, a market that turned against him, and a sickness that drained whatever the market had left behind. The debts were not small, the creditors were not patient, and the letter from her father's attorney, folded so many times it had gone soft at the creases, had made the situation plain in the precise, airless language that attorneys use when kindness would only complicate the bill. 14 days. That was what remained. She tucked the letter back into her coat and looked out at Goldhaven's main street, the gas lamps throwing amber circles on wet cobblestones, the iron storefronts, the carriages moving through mud with an unhurried dignity that suggested this city considered itself permanent. It had that quality, Goldhaven, the quality of a place that had decided, some decades prior, that it would matter, and had proceeded to make itself matter through steel and rail and the particular ambition of men who do not sleep well unless something is being built. Wallace Thornton had built most of it. The offices of Thornton Steel occupied the top 2 floors of the tallest building in the city, a 6-story structure of dark brick and iron trim that locals called the Column, without irony and without affection. It was simply what it was, the tallest thing around, belonging to the most powerful man around, and everyone had long since stopped remarking on the coincidence. Matilda took the stairs. The elevator attendant had looked at her trunk and shaken his head. She didn't argue. She had learned in the past 6 months to measure her energy carefully, to spend it only where it might return something. A secretary met her on the 5th-floor landing. He looked her over once, her plain coat, her sensible hat, the trunk she was dragging herself because she had not thought to arrange for it to be sent ahead, and said, without warmth, "Mr. Thornton will see you in 15 minutes. You may wait in the hall." She waited in the hall. Through the frosted glass panel of the office door, she could see the outline of a man standing at a window. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't moving at all, just standing, looking out at something below, or perhaps at nothing in particular, with the particular stillness of someone for whom stillness is not absence, but precision. As though motion, for this man, was a resource to be deployed, rather than a habit to be indulged. She watched him for the full 15 minutes. She filed what she observed. Wallace Thornton was not exactly what the newspapers made him. The papers loved him the way they love all men of his particular stature, with a combination of reverence and appetite that reveals more about the papers than the man. They called him a titan, a self-made sovereign of American steel. They printed formal portraits in which he looked severe and architectural, like something erected rather than born. The man who rose from behind the desk when Matilda was shown into the office was none of those things precisely, and yet all of them, in a way that resisted easy summary. He was lean, dark-haired. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that had not come from laughter. His desk was extraordinary. Mahogany, vast, covered in organized papers, with a precision that suggested he would notice immediately if a single page were moved a quarter of an inch in any direction. He stood behind it with the centered ease of someone who has occupied positions of authority long enough that authority has stopped feeling like a performance. He did not offer his hand. "Miss Grantley," he said. "Mr. Thornton, sit down." She sat. He remained standing for a moment longer. Not as a power display, she thought, but simply because sitting was something he would do when he was ready and not before. Then he pulled back his chair with a single economical motion, settled into it, and placed a brown folder on the desk between them. "You've read the terms." "I have. And you understand the nature of what's being proposed." "I understand contracts," Matilda said. "My father made certain of that before his health." She stopped, restarted at a cleaner point. "Yes, I understand." He looked at her. Not unkindly, but not with warmth either. the way a careful man examines a column of numbers before deciding whether they balance. "Your father's mill," he said, "is not a viable asset. The machinery is outdated by at least a decade. The outstanding debts exceed the property value by roughly 40%. The land carries some worth, but not enough to satisfy the primary creditors, let alone the secondary ones." He said this without theatre, which she appreciated. Clean facts, delivered cleanly. "What I'm offering is not a rescue of the mill. The mill is gone. What I'm offering is a rescue of your circumstances." "In exchange for a marriage," Matilda said. A brief pause. He had not expected her to say the word that plainly. She could see it. A small recalibration, like a door swinging 1 degree off its expected arc. "A contractual arrangement," he said, with the precision of a man who believes that language, handled correctly, can contain almost anything. "Legally binding. A minimum duration of 3 years. At the conclusion of that period, either party may elect to dissolve the arrangement according to the terms outlined in the appendix." He slid the folder toward her. "Your father's debts, all outstanding amounts, will be cleared within 30 days of signing. You will receive a monthly allowance of $250, a private residence on Aldermore Street, and access to the Thornton social account for expenses appropriate to your new position." He paused briefly. "In return, you will carry the name. You will attend the required functions. You will conduct yourself without scandal." Matilda looked at the folder. She did not open it. "Why me?" she said. He met her eyes. That same level, measuring look. "Because the men on my board of directors will not approve the Hartwell acquisition, a railroad deal worth $11 million, unless I demonstrate what they have been pleased to call personal stability." The phrase carried a faint trace of something that might, in another man, have been sardonic. "My reputation for operating without personal attachments has become, in this specific negotiation, a liability. A wife with a respectable name, even a reduced one, functions as a signal to these men, a sign of conventional reliability." He folded his hands on the desk. "It is not romantic. I see no reason to frame it as otherwise." "I didn't ask you to," Matilda said. Another recalibration, smaller this time. "There is one more thing," she said. He waited. "I will sign the contract," she said. "I will be what the arrangement requires, but there is a clause I want added." She kept her voice even. She had practiced this. "My father's medical expenses. Every bill, past, present, and future, for as long as he lives, covered entirely." A silence. "That was not in the original terms," he said. "No," she said. "It was not. I'm adding it." He looked at her for a long moment, not with irritation, with something closer to the expression of a man who has just encountered a variable he had not accounted for, and is deciding in real time how to weight it. "Done," he said. He picked up his pen and wrote the clause himself, in the margin of the final page, in handwriting so controlled it looked nearly mechanical. Then he pushed the contract back across the desk. Matilda picked up the pen. She had promised herself her hand would be steady. It was. She signed her full name, Matilda Ann Grantley, set the pen down precisely, and folded her hands in her lap. Wallace Thornton looked at the signature. Then he closed the folder. "We will be married on the 12th, he said. "The ceremony will be small. A judge and 2 witnesses." I assumed so. "Good." He stood, which she understood was her signal. "Mrs. Delacroix will arrange your transport to the Aldermore house this afternoon. Any questions regarding household arrangements should go through her." Matilda rose, picked up her coat, moved toward the door. "Miss Grantley." She turned. He was looking at the closed folder, not at her, as though the next thing he said required a certain distance to be said correctly. "I want to be clear about one thing," he said. "This arrangement asks of you exactly what is written. Nothing more is expected. Nothing more will be requested." She understood. He was telling her, in the only language he seemed to own, that precise, contractual, stripped of ornament, that some portion of her remained her own, that the performance had edges, that whatever lived inside those edges was still hers to keep. It was, she would think later, the most human thing he said to her for a very long time. "Understood," she said, and she walked out into the hallway, where the rain was still falling against the tall windows, grey and relentless, and the city of Goldhaven went on below as though nothing of consequence had just occurred. She had traded 14 days of desperation for 3 years of her life. She told herself it was a reasonable exchange. Standing at the window of the hallway, watching the rain, she almost believed it. Almost. And then she thought of her father's face, of the doctor's bills in the drawer, of the letter gone soft at the folds, and she understood that almost was enough. It would have to be. The house was too large for two people who had nothing to say to each other. That was Matilda's first thought when the carriage turned onto Aldermore Street, and the Thornton residence came into full view. A 4-story brownstone behind an iron fence, dark curtains in the upper windows, a front door painted the deep burgundy of old wine. Solid, expensive, the kind of house that announces its owner's position without making any effort to be liked. Her second thought was simpler. This is my life now. She unpacked her own trunk. No one offered to help, and she did not ask. Mrs. Delacroix, the housekeeper, a compact and watchful woman who communicated entire opinions through the precise angle of her chin, had shown her to the east bedroom on the 3rd floor without ceremony. A writing desk, a narrow wardrobe, a window that looked down onto the back garden, which was brown and dormant in the November cold. A connecting hallway that led, she was told, to the master bedroom on the west side. The door at the end of that hallway was locked. She did not try it. She set her books on the desk, hung her 3 good dresses in the wardrobe, and placed her father's photograph on the nightstand, a small oval portrait taken 8 years ago when he had still been well and the mill had still been his, and the future had not yet revealed its particular cruelty. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned down the lamp and went to sleep. The first week established the architecture of their arrangement. Wallace left the house before 7 each morning. She knew this not because she saw him go, but because by the time she came downstairs at 7:30, his coffee cup was already washed and set back in its place, his chair was pushed precisely under the breakfast table, and the morning edition of the Goldhaven Courier had been refolded along its original crease and left on the sideboard. Read completely, she suspected, and processed the way he seemed to process everything, efficiently, without remainder. He returned each evening between 6 and 8. Supper was served in the dining room, which seated 14 and felt, with 2 people at opposite ends of the long table, like a minor exercise in loneliness. They ate. They did not discuss anything that required more than 3 exchanges: the weather, the household accounts once, a question about whether she required anything from the market. She did not require anything from the market. After supper, he retired to his study. She read in the drawing room, or wrote letters to her father in Columbus, or simply sat near the fire and listened to the house settle around her, the creak of floorboards, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the distant sound of Wallace moving through his study above her head. She learned his patterns the way you learn the patterns of weather, not by being told, but by paying attention. He took his coffee black. He did not eat breakfast beyond toast. He worked on Saturdays until noon, and did not work on Sunday mornings, though what he did with Sunday mornings she could not determine, because the study door remained closed and no sound came through it. He had a habit, when thinking, of standing very still. She had noticed it through the frosted glass on the day they met, and she noticed it again, twice, when she passed the open study door and caught a glimpse of him at the window, looking out at nothing, perfectly motionless, as though thought for him was a physical state rather than an activity. She found this, despite herself, faintly interesting. The social functions began in the 3rd week. The first was a dinner at the home of Arthur Pembridge, a railroad man, and one of Wallace's board members, the kind of dinner where the crystal is irreproachable and the conversation is a second negotiation running quietly beneath the first. Matilda wore her best dress, which was navy blue and 3 seasons old, and did her hair herself because she had not yet established whether a lady's maid was part of her allowance or an additional request she would need to make. She made a note to ask Mrs. Delacroix in the morning. Wallace met her at the bottom of the stairs. He was already dressed, black coat, white shirt, the kind of effortless formality that suggested he had never in his life struggled with a collar, and he looked at her for a moment when she descended. Not the way a husband looks at a wife, the way a man looks at a variable he is assessing before it enters a controlled environment. "You look appropriate," he said. "Thank you," she said, with a tone that was entirely neutral and meant every syllable. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, the precursor to one, abandoned before it fully formed. The carriage ride to the Pembridge house took 12 minutes. They did not speak, but the silence on the way there was different from the silences in the house. Less empty somehow, more like 2 people holding something carefully, rather than 2 people with nothing to hold. At the dinner, Matilda was seated between Arthur Pembridge's wife Eleanor, a bright, sharp woman who asked good questions and actually listened to the answers, and a man named George Calder, who was some variety of investor and who spent the first course explaining his opinions on the Western Rail expansion, to Matilda, with the particular confidence of a man who assumes his audience's attention is a given. She listened. She asked at the precise right moment a question about bond structures that was specific enough to be genuine and framed simply enough to seem conversational. George Calder stopped mid-sentence. "You know finance," he said. Not a compliment exactly. More like a discovery he wasn't certain what to do with. "My father was in business," she said pleasantly. "One absorbs certain things." Across the table she was aware, without looking directly, that Wallace had heard the exchange. She did not look at him. But later, during the second course, she caught his eyes on her for a moment, before he returned to his own conversation, that measuring look again. Recalibrating, she ate her soup and said nothing more about bond structures. It was on a Wednesday at the end of the third week that the first crack appeared in the architecture. Not a dramatic crack. Not the kind that announces itself. The quiet kind. The kind you notice only later when you're trying to understand how something changed. She had been in the library, looking for a copy of anything readable among Wallace's collection, which ran heavily toward industrial economics and railroad law, when she pulled a volume from the lower shelf, and a folded paper fell out with it. She picked it up without thinking, unfolded it halfway before she realized it was personal. A letter, handwritten, from someone named R. Thornton, the handwriting unsteady in the way of someone very young or very tired. She caught only a few words before she refolded it deliberately and placed it back inside the cover. "I know you won't come, you never do, but I keep writing because—" She slid the book back onto the shelf. She chose a different volume and went back to the drawing room and did not mention it. But she thought about it. She thought about the handwriting, unsteady, young, and about the word never, and about the fact that Wallace Thornton, who controlled a steel empire and $11 million railroad negotiations and the temperature of every room he walked into, had kept that letter folded inside a book he presumably never opened, on a shelf where presumably no one ever looked. People keep things in places like that for two reasons: because they cannot throw them away, or because they are afraid of what it means that they cannot throw them away. That night she heard him come up the stairs later than usual. She heard him pause in the connecting hallway, just for a moment, just long enough to be a pause and not merely a footstep, outside the locked door between them. Then he walked on. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle. She thought, there is more to him than the contract describes. And then, more carefully, that is not your business, Matilda. But the thought had arrived, and thoughts, once arrived, are not always willing to leave on request. She had come to Goldhaven to survive. She had not come to understand Wallace Thornton. But the house was large, and the silences were long, and understanding, it turned out, has a way of beginning without your permission. December arrived in Goldhaven the way trouble often does, quietly and all at once. The first snow came on a Monday. By Wednesday the streets were packed hard and white, and the column threw a long shadow across the ice each morning that reached almost to the opposite side of the block. Matilda watched it from the drawing-room window while she took her coffee, and thought, not for the first time, that Goldhaven was a city that had been designed by men who wanted other men to feel small. She did not feel small. She had decided some years ago that feeling small was a luxury she could not afford, but she felt increasingly the particular pressure of a secret that has been carried too long in too confined a space. It had begun before Goldhaven, before the contract, before the train, before the letter gone soft at the folds. It had begun 18 months ago in Columbus, when her father's bookkeeper, a nervous, slope-shouldered man named Peter Arvis, had come to her rather than to her father, because her father was already too ill to carry the weight of what Arvis had found. He had sat across from her at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and told her, in a voice barely above a whisper, that Gerald Grantley's largest remaining creditor was not a bank. It was a man named Douglas Crail, and Douglas Crail was not simply a creditor. He was a silent partner in 3 of Wallace Thornton's subsidiary operations, a fact that appeared in no public record, was mentioned in no newspaper, and existed only in a private ledger that Arvis had seen once briefly and had the presence of mind to copy 2 pages of before returning it to exactly where he found it. Those 2 pages were currently sewn into the lining of Matilda's winter trunk. She had not planned when she signed the contract to use them. She had told herself they were insurance, the kind you carry hoping never to collect. She had told herself that Douglas Crail was a distant problem, a peripheral figure, someone whose connection to Wallace Thornton was probably coincidental, and certainly not her concern. She had told herself many things in the past 18 months. She was running out of room to keep telling them. The letter arrived on the second Thursday of December, addressed to Mrs. Wallace Thornton in a handwriting she recognized immediately. Peter Arvis, the slope-shouldered bookkeeper. She opened it in her room, with the door closed and the lamp turned low. The way you open things you already know will cost you something. It was short. Arvis was not a man given to elaboration. He knows the ledger was copied. He doesn't know by whom. He is looking. I would not wait much longer, Mrs. Thornton. If waiting is what you have been doing, what you carry is either your protection or your destruction, depending entirely on the moment you choose to use it. Choose carefully. Choose soon. She read it twice. Then she folded it, held it over the lamp flame until it caught, and set it in the iron ashtray on the writing desk and watched it become ash. Then she sat very still for a long time, her hands folded in her lap, and did what she had always done when the ground shifted beneath her. She thought. Douglas Crail's connection to Thornton Steel, if it could be proven, if it could be documented with the 2 ledger pages sewn into her trunk lining, represented something significant. Crail was currently under quiet investigation by 2 members of the Ohio State Legislature for financial conduct that violated the terms of a public contract. If his name appeared in connection with Thornton's operations, the Hartwell acquisition, the $11 million railroad deal that was the entire engine of Wallace's current position, would collapse. The board would not survive the association. The deal required federal approval. Federal approval required clean hands, or at least the appearance of them. She was sitting, she understood now, on something that could bring down everything Wallace Thornton had spent his life building. She had not chosen this. She had simply been paying attention when no one thought she was worth watching. She almost told him that Thursday evening. They were in the drawing room after supper, him at his desk near the window with a stack of correspondence, her in the chair by the fire with a book she had not read a single page of in the past 40 minutes, and the silence between them had settled into the particular quality it sometimes reached in the evenings now. Not empty, not comfortable exactly, but lived in, the kind of silence that has stopped requiring explanation. She had the words arranged. She had thought about how to say it, plainly, directly, the way he said things, without ornament or apology. There is something you need to know. It involves Douglas Crail. I have documentation. I did not come here to use it against you. She had the words arranged, and she said none of them. Because at that precise moment, Wallace set down his pen, leaned back in his chair, and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose, a gesture so small and so private that she understood immediately it was not performed for anyone. He was tired, not the professional tiredness of a man who works long hours, the other kind, the kind that lives deeper. He stayed like that for a moment. Then he straightened, picked up his pen, and returned to the correspondence as though nothing had occurred. She looked back at her book. The words she had arranged dissolved quietly and went back to wherever unused words go. She told herself she was waiting for a better moment. She told herself timing mattered. Both of these things were true, and neither of them was the whole truth, and she knew it. The better moment did not come before the situation moved on its own. 4 days later, on a Monday morning, she came downstairs to find Wallace already in the breakfast room. Unusual, since he was always gone before she rose, standing at the window with a telegram in his hand and an expression on his face that she had not seen before. Not anger, closer to the controlled stillness of a man who has just absorbed a blow and has not yet decided what to do about it. He heard her come in. He did not turn. "Sit down, Mrs. Thornton." She sat. He turned then and placed the telegram on the table between them, face up. His eyes were on her, not with accusation, not yet, but with the specific quality of attention he gave to things he was in the process of understanding. She looked at the telegram. It was from his attorney in Columbus. Crail matter surfacing, legislative inquiry expanding, source of ledger copy unknown, but search ongoing. Recommend immediate review of all associated accounts. 3 names flagged in preliminary inquiry, one connected to Grantley estate, her father's name. She felt the blood leave her face in a single clean movement, the way water leaves a glass when the glass tips. She looked up. Wallace was still watching her. "Is there something," he said very quietly, "that you would like to tell me?" The question was not loud. It did not need to be. It had the quality of something that had been precisely aimed from a very short distance. She held his gaze, held it for the full length of several heartbeats, and then she said the only true thing she had left. "Yes," she said, "there is." The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He did not reach for the telegram. He did not look away from her. "Then tell me," he said. And so she began. She told him almost everything. She told him about Arvis, and about the kitchen table in Columbus, and about the ledger and what it showed. She told him that she had known about the Crail connection before she signed the contract, that she had walked into his office with this knowledge already in her possession, sewn into the lining of her trunk, carried as a last resort. She told him she had not intended to use it against him. She watched his face while she spoke. It was extraordinary, she thought, how completely still a man could become when the architecture of something large was shifting around him. He did not interrupt. He did not react in the visible ways that people usually react to revelations of this kind. He simply listened, with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and she understood, watching him, that this was perhaps the most dangerous thing about Wallace Thornton. Not his power, not his money. His capacity to receive information without flinching, to sit with it, to turn it over and assess its weight before responding. When she finished, the silence stretched for nearly a full minute. Then he said, "Where is the documentation?" Not a question, a direction. "Upstairs," she said, "in my trunk." He nodded. "Once. You should have told me before now," he said. "I know. Why didn't you?" She looked at him, at the lines at the corners of his eyes, at the telegram on the table between them, at the man who had written a clause into a contract margin without hesitation, because she had asked him to, who kept an unsteady letter folded inside a book on a low shelf, who pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose when he thought no one was watching. "Because I wasn't certain," she said, "what you would do with it." Another silence. "And now?" he said. "Now," she said, "I think I was wrong to wait." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but the precursor to something, the door before the room. "Get the documentation," he said. "Bring it here. We'll go through it tonight." She rose. "Mrs. Thornton," she paused. He was looking at the table, not at her. The same distance he had needed in his office on the day they met to say the thing that mattered. "You could have used this," he said, "at any point. You had the means to end this arrangement on your terms, with leverage I couldn't have countered." A pause. "You didn't." "No," she said. "I didn't." He said nothing further, but when she turned toward the door, she heard him exhale, slowly, deliberately, in the way of a man releasing something he has been holding for a very long time. She went upstairs and retrieved the 2 pages from the trunk lining. She carried them back down, and she set them on the table between them, and they sat across from each other in the breakfast room with the snow coming down outside and the truth finally occupying the space it had always belonged in. She had carried the secret like a weapon she never wanted to fire. Now it lay on the table between them, and neither of them had been destroyed by it. Not yet. The empire was still standing, but the ground beneath it had shifted quietly and permanently in the space of one morning. And Wallace Thornton, for the first time since she had known him, did not look like a man who was entirely in control. He looked like a man who was beginning to understand that control had never been the point. The hearing was set for the 3rd Monday of December, not a public trial. Not yet. A closed legislative inquiry, held in a wood-paneled room on the 2nd floor of the Goldhaven Municipal Building, attended by 4 state representatives, 2 federal observers, 3 attorneys, and precisely the wrong number of people for a secret to survive. Wallace had spent the previous 4 days in his study, without sleeping more than a few hours at a time. Matilda knew this, because the lamp under his door was still burning when she woke at 2 in the morning, and already burning again when she rose at 6. She brought him coffee twice without being asked. He accepted it both times without comment, but on the 2nd occasion he looked up from the papers spread across his desk and held her gaze for a moment in a way that said, without any words at all, that he understood what she was doing and that it mattered. She nodded once and went back downstairs. That was enough. The 2 ledger pages had confirmed everything Arvis had told her in the Columbus kitchen 18 months ago. Douglas Crail held a concealed financial interest in 3 Thornton subsidiary operations, interest structured deliberately to avoid public disclosure, routed through a holding company registered in a state where the filing requirements were, at that time, considerably less rigorous than they should have been. It was not, Wallace's attorney had explained on the first evening, necessarily criminal on Wallace's part. The arrangements had been inherited from his predecessor, established before Wallace took full control of the company. He had known of Crail's involvement in a general sense, as a legacy investor, a residual presence. but had not known the specific structure, had not known the concealment, and had not known that Crail was simultaneously positioned in a public contract that made the connection not merely embarrassing but legally significant. That distinction mattered. Whether the inquiry would care about the distinction was a different question. On the Sunday evening before the hearing, Wallace came downstairs and sat across from Matilda in the drawing room for the first time without papers, without correspondence, without the insulation of work between them. He sat with his hands folded and looked at the fire for a long moment before he spoke. "The Hartwell deal is gone," he said. She said nothing. She had known this for several days. "The board will likely call for a review of my position," he continued. "Calder is already circling. He has been for 2 years waiting for something like this." A pause. "He may get the company." The fire snapped once in the silence. "And Crail?" she said. "Crail will cooperate with the inquiry to reduce his own exposure. He will give them whatever they ask for." Wallace's voice was flat, factual, stripped of everything except the information itself. "He will give them my name alongside his own, and the distinction between inherited liability and deliberate concealment will become a matter of interpretation." He paused. "Legal interpretation, which is to say, expensive and uncertain." Matilda looked at him, at the man who had 4 days ago sat across from her at the breakfast table and received the dismantling of his empire with the same stillness he brought to everything. And she thought about what it costs a person to be still in the face of that, what it requires, what it takes from you over years to make that stillness your first and only response to everything that threatens you. "You knew the risk when you sat down with me that morning," she said, "after I told you." "Yes. You could have used the documentation yourself, gotten ahead of the inquiry, controlled the terms." "Yes," he said again. "Why didn't you?" He looked at the fire. A long moment passed. "Because you brought it to me," he said. "Not as a weapon, not as leverage. You brought it to me as information that I needed, and you handed it over without condition." He paused. "I have done business in this city for 14 years. Very few people have ever handed me anything without condition." The fire settled. Outside, the snow had stopped, and Goldhaven was very quiet. "The 3 years," Matilda said. "The contract." He turned to look at her directly. She held his gaze. "What about it?" he said. "The basis of the arrangement was the Hartwell acquisition," she said. "Your board's confidence, the signal of stability." She kept her voice steady. "Those conditions no longer exist. The contract was built on a foundation that is gone." She unfolded her hands in her lap. "I want to release you from it." The silence that followed was the longest they had yet shared in that room. "That is not," he said carefully, "what I want." She looked at him. "The contract was a structure," he said, "built for a specific purpose, using the only language I knew how to use." He stopped, looked at the fire again briefly, then back at her. "I am not particularly skilled at other kinds of language." "I know," she said. "But I am aware," he continued, "that what has occurred in this house over the past weeks is not what I designed, and I am aware that I would not, given the choice, undo it." A pause. "I would not undo any of it." It was not a declaration. It was not the kind of thing written in novels or spoken in parlors. It was delivered the way Wallace Thornton delivered everything that mattered to him, precisely, without flourish, with the full weight of someone who does not say things he does not mean. Matilda was quiet for a moment. "The inquiry is tomorrow," she said. "Yes. And whatever happens tomorrow happens." "Yes." She nodded slowly, looked at the fire, looked back at him. "Then we go tomorrow," she said, "together. You answer the inquiry on your own terms, with the documentation as context, and you let the board do what the board will do." She met his eyes. "And whatever is left afterward, we figure out from there." He looked at her for a long time. "You don't have to stay for this," he said. "Your father's debts are cleared. The clause was honored. You are under no obligation." "I know what I'm under," Matilda said, with a quiet firmness that closed the sentence completely. He said nothing further, but something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, not in the way of men in stories, in the small, almost invisible way of someone who has been braced for a long time against a weight they expected to carry alone, and has just felt for the first time another pair of hands. The inquiry took 4 hours. Wallace testified clearly and without performance. He presented the documentation, established the timeline of his knowledge, and made the distinction between inherited liability and deliberate concealment in terms precise enough that even the federal observers wrote things down. Crail, as predicted, gave them everything. But everything, as it turned out, was less damaging than anticipated, because the 2 ledger pages Matilda had carried in her trunk lining for 18 months provided a paper trail that contextualized Crail's testimony in ways Crail had not expected and could not contradict. The Hartwell acquisition was formally withdrawn that afternoon. George Calder called for a board review the following morning. The review was granted. 3 days before Christmas, the board voted, 7-5. Wallace retained his position, reduced in scope, stripped of 2 subsidiary operations, subject to ongoing review. He did not lose the company, but Goldhaven's understanding of Wallace Thornton shifted permanently that December. The way understanding always shifts when the architecture of a powerful man becomes briefly visible. The city went on, the column still stood, but something had changed in the way people looked at it. He was powerful, yes, but he was also, it turned out, a man, with blind spots and inherited liabilities, and a wife who had sewn 2 pages of documentation into her trunk lining and carried them across the state without telling anyone. That last part travelled through the drawing rooms of Goldhaven with remarkable speed. Eleanor Pembridge mentioned it to 3 people on a Tuesday. By Thursday, it had reached 12. By the following Monday, Matilda Grantley, Mrs. Thornton, was no longer the quiet, plainly dressed woman nobody had thought to watch. She was the woman who had walked into the most powerful house in Goldhaven with a secret in her luggage and the patience to know exactly when to use it. Not against him, for him. The distinction, once understood, changed everything. On the last evening of December, Wallace came home at 5 o'clock, earlier than he had ever come home, and found Matilda in the library, reading in the chair by the window. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked up. He crossed the room, sat down in the chair across from hers and said nothing. She said nothing. Outside, Goldhaven moved through the last hours of the year. The carriages, the gas lamps, the ice on the cobblestones, the long shadow of the column stretching across the street in the winter dusk. Inside, for the first time, the silence between them was not the silence of 2 people with nothing to say. It was the silence of 2 people who had finally stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. The contract was still on file. Neither of them mentioned it. Neither of them would, not that evening, and not in the weeks that followed. Some agreements, once they have been lived past their original terms, stop being contracts. They become something else entirely, something without a clause for dissolution. The empire had bent. It had not broken, and the woman no one had thought to watch had been, from the very first morning, the reason why.